everyone. Are all of you ready to get started? Well, guess what? We're finally ready to get started also. So good morning. I want to welcome everyone here. And to those of you who have traveled great distances to be here, very much welcome to you. If you are locally here from Toledo and you saw this on the news, or you read about it in the newspaper, or you just heard about it from the library, thank you for being here and welcome. This is the celebration, and we'll talk about celebration of what in just a moment. But I want to thank you to all the attendees for being here with us to help us celebrate. And I would be remiss if I did not at the very beginning thank you to this wonderful library. To the library, yes, thank you. Boy, I felt almost like a politician there, just made a good point or something. But it was a good point too. It's a beautiful library. And if you had not been here before, you were probably like us the first time we walked in to the lobby down there and we're like, whoa, wow, is this a magnificent building? And also to Nancy Eames and all of her staff here at the library. They have done so much work to host us. They've done so much work behind the scenes. They helped plan the games. They have done physical, moving books around, organizing things, displays that were in the library for this event. So if you see any of them here, please be sure to thank them. They have done so much work. Well, I mentioned it's a celebration. What are we here today celebrating? Happy Arbor Day. Okay, how many of you knew today is Arbor Day? 1, 2, 3, 4. Okay, so for the rest of you, today is Arbor Day. But that's not why we're here. We're here to celebrate a couple of different things. We're here to celebrate Nancy Drew 95. Nancy Drew 95. What happened 95 years ago from this coming Monday? Who knows? Gentleman right there in the white shirt with his hand up. What happened?
The first 3 reader books were published.
That's right. The first 3 Nancy Drew books were published 95 years ago this coming Monday. So 95 years of Nancy Drew. We're also celebrating 25 years of Nancy Drew Sleuths. How many of you are members of Nancy Drew Sleuths? Most of you. And if you are not, welcome to those who are not, or maybe you're just not yet. But we're glad to have all of you here. So 25 years there. It started 2001 right here in Toledo. Were any of you here for that very first meeting? Look right here. Yes, yes. And back there in the back. So a few of you were here 25 years ago right here in Toledo. Well, it's going to be my pleasure in just a moment to introduce the lady who started all of this 25 years ago when she was only 10 years old. So Jen Fisher is a Nancy Drew consultant and an author. Her book called Clues for Real Life, The Classic Wit and Wisdom of Nancy Drew was published in 2007. And she's currently working on her second book about Mildred Wirt Benson, who was the original Carolyn Keene and was a bit of Nancy Drew herself, I understand. So she is working on that. Jen is president of the Nancy Drew fan group. She plans all of their annual conventions and meetings, and sometimes, like this year, have 2. And I don't know how many of you have ever been involved corporately or any other way in planning a big event. If you have, you understand the amount of work and effort it takes to put something like this together. If any of you have ever thrown a dinner party at your own house, just take that effort and multiply it by like a gazillion, and you have how much effort it takes to put something like this together. And she does that on an annual basis. She donated her extensive Nancy Drew collection to this library a few years ago. And if you have not yet seen it, it is in the Nancy Drew room, which is kind of that direction. No, that direction. That's right, my wife is correcting me. It's that direction in the library here, an entire beautiful room just for that collection. And if you have not seen it, please take some time before you leave this afternoon and enjoy seeing that collection. You can learn more about the group. I had to look down here because I want to get this right, at nancydrewsleuths.com, and about the Sleuth fan group and conventions at nancydrewfans.com. So, she is going to share with us now about two topics: Nancy Drew Collecting 101. Or do we have any Nancy Drew collectors here? Well, more hands went up that time. All right. So Nancy Drew Collecting 101 and the history behind the mystery. So ladies and gentlemen, let's give it up for Miss Jennifer Fisher.
Thank you, Alan, for that great welcome. I was a very precocious 10-year-old when I started all of this. No, I get that a lot. Like, how have you been doing this for 20 years and you look like you're 10 years old? Welcome, everybody. I'm glad you're here today to join us for this celebration of Nancy Drew's history and collecting. We're going to start off I'm going to kind of go through an announcement, especially for those of you who are just here today and weren't here last night when I talked about it. But I'm going to start off with our Mildred Wirt Benson HARP project, which is the Mildred Wirt Benson Historic Artifacts Recovery Project, which I launched this year and sort of am officially launching right now at this event. And let me grab my papers here. There we go. So in your goodie bags, you're going to get a little card. And we have some extras here if you're local and want one. It's about the project and just kind of a little brief statement on what we do and how you can get involved. But how this kind of began is there are some collectors and people out there that have a lot of Mildred Wirt Benson's papers and artifacts. Back about 30 years ago, in the 1990s, there were a couple of sales of some of her memorabilia. Now, don't get me wrong, she did donate a lot of her papers to the University of Iowa, where they have the Iowa Women's Archive, and they have an archive of her stuff there. She also sent some things to the Smithsonian. Unfortunately, they're not on display, but she also sent one of her typewriters there. So there are some places out there that some of her items. And also here in Toledo, up in local history, the Rare Book Room does have some of her items. There's her NASA application for a journalist in space, which is pretty neat. They have, thanks to Rick, our local collector, they have a full set of all the books that she wrote that were published, 135 books. And so his collection went here quite a few years ago, and you can see it up in the Rare Book Room. And they have some other artifacts like her flight logs and just some neat and unusual ephemera items. And then they have my collection. And so there were some sales where some of her papers were where some of her papers were sold to collectors. At least a couple of different sales, one that had quite a few prominent items in it. And so for about 30 years, some of these items have been in private hands. And I've spoken to some of the people that have these items. Some have sold quite a few of theirs years ago to other collectors. Some hang on to them. One kind of lamented the fact that they've just been sitting in a filing cabinet for 30 years and she's not sure what she wants to do with them. And so there's lots of things going on in that arena. And so my goal, because of a recent incident, is to try to rehome these items to an archive here to Toledo, to Iowa, wherever we can get them, depending on what someone's interested in doing with them. And if they're not interested in donating them or selling them, then we would love to have copies so we can create a record and an archive of what is out there. Because it's very important to preserve that for history's sake, for scholars and researchers and fans to be able to access these items. And it's very important because someday, those of you who have items like that, and those of you who have your regular collections, you wonder, what are you going to do with your collection? What are you going to do with these historical artifacts someday? And when you're gone, is your family or your friends or whoever you're trusting to be the executor of your will, if you hopefully have a will. As a lawyer, I should recommend have a will. But what will happen to it? Will your wishes be granted? Will they do what you want them to do? Or you have an opportunity to do something now, or at least make an arrangement for something to happen later. You can send your items here on loan, where they're still owned by you, but they're on loan here for people to access and learn from. There's lots of things that can be done. So please, if you have anything like that, I would love a copy to give to the archives for the record. And at some point, if you're willing to donate or sell, we would love that, so we can preserve these items and properly archive them, for generations and hopefully centuries to come. So that project is near and dear to my heart. So a couple of months ago, there was an issue with a collector and the estate, and she had no children, she had nobody. And so liquidators had to come in and deal with her belongings. Papers got thrown away, recycled, shredded. They didn't know what they had. So it was very distressing and so disheartening. And so that I had been thinking about this project for some time, and that incident just kicked me into higher gear, and I was like, we've got to do something about this. So that is my goal, is to chase down all of these papers and all of these collectors and try to at least create a record and hopefully get some donations or be able to purchase some of these items. And coincidentally, the library right about now, we created a fund for my Nancy Drew collection and the collection here to be able to acquire some of these items where people might prefer to sell, or something comes up maybe at eBay, there's an interesting document or some interesting item that would be great for the collection. And so we'll have the ability to hopefully purchase some of those things. And so it's just all kind of comes in hand together, and hopefully as a community, we can work to create this archive and get some of these things back. So one item I did manage to recover from this estate that did not get shredded, which was great. I'm going to hold up. If you saw these last night over in the Nancy Drew area, they were by some of the paintings hanging outside the room. There's two of them. They put them in frames. Lot number 1 of a sale in 1997 through Yellowback Library was 2 pages of a 3-page plot that Millie wrote for Edward Stratemeyer. Now, if you understand the syndicate and what Stratemeyer did, he hired ghostwriters, but he provided plots to them. He didn't usually ask for them to submit ideas to him like this. But he did ask Millie. I think he was very interested in what she was doing, and he liked her writing style. So she submitted a 3-page plot to Stratemeyer. Over the years, something happened to page 2. So we have pages 1 and 3. And these were sold in that sale for $1,000 to the person who bought it. And we were able to recover lot number 1. It's right here. This is page 1. And then the other frame is page 3. Now, allegedly, Stratemeyer rejected the plot idea. He thought it a bit wild. And reading through it, it doesn't seem that wild to me. But maybe the missing page was really wild. I don't know. We can only speculate. But I'm just so proud that I was able to acquire this, and I donated it here to the Toledo Public Library. So researchers, archivists will be able to access it and use it for projects and the information. But this is very historic, this particular item, and very, very important. So I was thrilled that we were able to get this. So that's our big score for this project to start us off. Anyhow, these will be on display again through the weekend. I don't know, Nancy, will they be back over in the children's after this program? Yes, okay, good. So you can go and read them, take a photo of it, and then you can read it and check out what was wild about it. Today's standards obviously are different than back then, and Edward was a little Victorian-minded, so, you know, Millie was kind of a little more progressive. Okay, so I wanted to go over that project with everybody real quick, and this is just an image of page 1, and on the right is the ad, part of the ad that was for the sale, and I noted that I recovered it in February of 25. So yeah, so I'm just really thrilled about that. So everybody be excited about that. And like I mentioned, there is a fund here for the collection, not only to acquire items, but also to expand the collection and make it even more well-rounded, and for display purposes, advertising, digitizing, which is hugely important to create an online record that people can access that can't always come here to Toledo, and a finding aid. So all of this goes hand in hand. There are envelopes here if you choose to make a donation. Nancy kind of brought that up last night. I still have my check to turn in. One of our members who couldn't make it wanted her registration fee donated to the library for the fund. And another member here today, she wasn't going to attend the mystery dinner, so I was going to refund her for that. And she wanted her portion for that to also go to the fund. So thank you very much for that. We appreciate it, because that will be very well used. So anyhow, just a little bit more about what I do. I appreciate Alan's introduction. That was great. When I was actually 10 years old, from Nancy Drew fan to Nancy Drew expert, how did this even happen? Really quickly, in the early 2000s, for several years, quite a few of us had been gathering online in these message boards and little groups, kind of when people were getting on the internet around 1997, and it was becoming more mainstream. And there was an old message board, and I won't go into the details, the drama, but there was always drama on that board. And so another collector friend that I had met, kind of what I call the older guard of collectors that were really big into collecting in the 80s and the early 90s, before I discovered all of this and got into it, kind of took me under her wing. Her name's Gail, and we decided to start our own discussion group at this place called E-Groups, which then became Yahoo Groups, and then kind of went defunct when Facebook became a big thing, and we all moved over to Facebook. But it was kind of like an email list, and we called ourselves Nancy Drew Sleuths. And so we were just basically a group of women, men, hanging out. We would chat about the books. We would trade books with each other, sell books, and just, have fun talking about them and talking about different themes in the book. People would go squabble over Nancy's hair color, all these kind of fun things, right? And so we had a lot of fun, and we came here to Toledo in 2001, and we met Millie. She was the original ghostwriter, for those of you who don't know, for the Nancy Drew series, and she still was living here in Toledo and working at the Toledo Blade, and she was in her 90s. She was definitely a consummate workaholic, but it kind of kept her going. It was her life. And we got to meet her, and it's just a funny story. She was interviewing me before she met everybody in the conference room, because she was going to write an article about our visit. And she wasn't on the internet. She wasn't a part of all these chat groups. And so she didn't really understand how they all work. She wasn't familiar with it. And she asked me what my role was. And so I was called on that old group, the discussion moderator. So I told her, I'm the moderator. I'm the discussion moderator. She did not like the sound of that, and she didn't really get the concept of that because she wasn't on these forums. So she said, no, I'm going to make you the president of the group. So I was 10 years old, and so I said, well, I don't know about this. And some of the people that were here were like, oh yeah, you can be the president. That's great. And I said, well, okay, but I'm still the moderator of the discussion group. So I just kind of went with it. And it snowballed to where we are today. We kind of formed and got more organized formally, I suppose. We started working on conventions after that. It was kind of an unofficial. We didn't really consider it. It was like a gathering of just 12 of us here. And Rick was a huge part of that in helping us organize that and get us to see Millie and everything. That was great. But everybody wanted to keep getting together. So that's kind of how it started. We started publishing a zine called The Sleuth, which we now just do special issues of. from time to time, we got with Simon & Schuster and sort of became more official and officially licensed to be able to create merchandise and do these conventions. And just for fun, I thought I'd show a few pictures of some of our past events that we've done. The top left is Millie when we met her that first year. And she was in the conference room at the Blade. She was signing books for us. And down in the bottom center, there's Nancy here from the library and myself when they dedicated the literary landmark plaque for Millie a few years ago. And we always have a lot of fun. We try to follow in Nancy's footsteps at these events. So we typically have a theme book where we'll go somewhere and do things Nancy and her pals did in the book and just kind of have a lot of fun. So we've had a lot of fun over 25 years, and it's just kind of great to be back here 25 years after we started. It's kind of poignant. And so I have two websites. The first is nancydrewsleuth.com, and that's kind of your everything Nancy Drew website, and that's where you're going to be able to research more about what I'm about to talk about if you want to learn more, because I'm just going to go over some highlights. Anything you want to know about Nancy Drew, collecting, and all of that. There's checklists of things. There's all sorts of format information, so it's a good resource. I was able to publish a book called Clues for Real Life in 2007 for a licensee company that Simon & Schuster had worked with. It's kind of a little gifty book. And so then I started on my journey of working on the biography about Millie. And it's been something I've worked on off and on for several years. I've been able to publish articles in the Smithsonian, Saturday Evening Post, LA Times, and some other publications as I've been researching and writing about all of this. Before I donated my collection, and just forgive the rats running around my collection, these were taken at an annual Halloween party for Nancy Drew. So I had all sorts of spiders, pumpkins, rats, every little thing running around. But this was some of my collection as I displayed it in the house before donating. And this isn't everything, but it's a lot of the books that I had. And then, of course, came the donation here. And just briefly, for those of you who don't know, in 2019, Nancy reached out to me from the library. I had mentioned several years before that I wanted to donate my collection someday. And I, of course, thought I was 10, so I thought maybe when I was 80 that I might be able to donate it, or somebody might want it, because I kind of thought of my collection as, it was very large, but it also had a lot of what I call puzzle pieces, which is all those little puzzle pieces that kind of tell the story of Nancy Drew and the production of collectibles and books and things behind the scenes and advertising items and just all of it kind of that went hand in hand together. So I figured down the road, right? So Nancy contacts me, and apparently the library was going under a renovation at the time. And it was a very big renovation, kind of a historic renovation, really. And it was just like the opportunity to do it then, and they could carve a space out for it. So I didn't hesitate very long. I just decided, yeah, let's do it. Because it sat in my home, and it was great for me. And sometimes people came to visit, but it wasn't really serving a purpose to me. And I felt like it would be something everybody could enjoy and learn from, and hopefully could inspire younger generations of readers to pick up these books and enjoy what we loved about them. So those were kind of my motivating factors in donating the collection. And so I can't thank them enough for allowing me to have that opportunity. I've heard from a lot of collectors that are not sure what they want to do with their collections. And I hope this maybe inspires some of you to find a place like Toledo, to find maybe a library or a museum or somewhere that might be interested in some of the things you have if you want it to kind of live on at some point like this. But it's been great. And so anyhow, that's kind of my background, how I came to be part of the head of the Sleuths, thanks to Millie. So yeah, I was a very precocious 10-year-old. So that is just so funny, Alan. So I'm going to get into two parts of my talk, and I'm just going to kind of go over some highlights because really, like, Nancy Drew could fill novels of information, and there is so much information out there that you wouldn't even believe. But we don't have time for that. So I'm going to talk about the history behind the mystery, and then I'm going to talk a little bit about collecting. Now, did everybody pick up one of these little folders? If you didn't, they're just on the table right outside. These are going to kind of come in handy and be handy for you after the talks. But basically, there's a timeline on the yellow page, front and back. And this is basically highlights of Nancy Drew's history over the years, some fun facts and fun little things. Now, on my website, in the history section, there is also a timeline too. It has a little bit more than this does. It's more full, and you can always access that. And then for my collecting talk, some of you who are on Facebook have probably seen this image that I've posted, our book fans group. And it's just kind of a Nancy Drew Formats 101. And it helps you kind of figure out what you have and maybe how old it is and all that good stuff. And then there's a sheet of paper with all the places you can find us online, the websites, the social media, and other links for research. And the last thing is the bingo card, and I'll get to that at the end. But there's going to be a little bingo challenge here that kind of takes you to the collection room and gets you to check it out and mark things off. And then we'll give out some prizes. So you want to complete it if you can, because the prizes will go to those who mark off every space. So we'll go on the honor system. I know you guys are going to tackle it like Nancy Drew and find all the stuff. And so anyhow, we'll do that, and then I'll give prizes out after the movie's over. And so anyhow, that's what this is for. So in 95 years, if you didn't know it, there have been over 600 cases solved. There are over 600 Nancy Drew books that have been published since 1930. And I know a lot of you are really familiar with the classic books, but you might not be as familiar with all the spin-offs and all the different series in the modern era that have come out. And that's where we get up to the 600 figure. There were 56 books in the classic series and then paperbacks that went on from there. I thought it would be kind of fun to just look at some images of Nancy over the years as we celebrate the 95th. In the 30s, you know, we had the Tandy illustrations, and if you haven't been over there to see the Tandy paintings hanging in the room, the library owns Shadow Ranch, and Mike, there he is, he lent The Secret in the Old Attic, which is one of the Tandys that he owns. So they're beautiful. I would recommend checking those out if you haven't seen them yet. But Nancy was so sophisticated in the 1930s. Today, the books that are sort of the modern equivalent of these books, the diary series, Nancy's illustrated very young. She looks very young for being 18. Back when these first came out, Nancy was only 16 years old. And so she looks incredibly sophisticated for a 16-year-old, especially if you're looking at these from today's era. But they're beautiful images of Nancy Drew. We get into the 40s and the 50s, and you can kind of see how her looks changed. We go from Tandy to other artists, Bill Gillies, Rudy Nappy, and this is sort of just her evolution over the years. We get into the 60s, and you see her hair change color. I mentioned collectors squabbling over hair color. Some people there, Nancy is blonde, and some people there, Nancy is Titian, or redheaded. And so her hair became more red. And we get into the 70s, and we get sort of these really interesting covers, like the creepy robot and the glowing eye. And so things kind of evolve. And then we sort of segue into some of the more modern books. Triple Hoax, the first paperback that was published, number 57, on up. And then we have some examples of some of the modern series. The Notebooks and Clue Crew, those are for young kids. The regular series that continued, the Digest, and then the Girl Detective, the Nancy Drew Files. So this is sort of a nice glance at Nancy Drew over the years and how she changed. Of course, we have Diaries, which is current, and comic books. I mean, you can see very, very modern take on the comic books for Nancy Drew. So I'm going to segue into the history behind the mystery. Before we talk about Nancy Drew's history, I just want to mention a couple of things that were going on in the decade before Nancy Drew came out. Women got the right to vote in 1920. Yay. That was a hard-fought battle. That was a big thing. Millie was off at college at the time. It was, of course, the Roaring 20s. We had the Flapper Girls. Things were changing for women. And then series books. Some examples of some series books from the 1920s. We had Betty Gordon and her school chums. We had the Blythe Girls. We had the Outdoor Girls. And as you can see, they're having their little fun adventures with school friends and going on picnics and hanging out in the forest together. And then we had Ruth Fielding, a Stratemeyer series that Millie would go on to start writing for. And Ruth's just kind of hanging out in the forest, reading a book and having fun. And I don't know if you noticed something from these books, but there's just something about them. I don't know, maybe the word is namby-pamby. That was a famous phrase Millie used, and she was quoted in saying, "I wanted to do something different." Mrs. Benson once said, "The heroines of girls' books back then were all namby-pamby." I was expressing a sort of tomboy spirit, and of course I included the definition of namby-pamby: lacking in character or substance, insipid, weak, indecisive. Well, Nancy Drew was definitely not namby-pamby. She was incredibly sophisticated, adventurous. Secret passageways did not scare her. She was very bold. But Nancy Drew didn't start with Millie. She started with Edward Stratemeyer. So how many of you are familiar with Edward Stratemeyer? Hopefully most of the sleuths are by now. So Edward was what would be called a book packager today. He formed what he called the Stratemeyer Syndicate in 1905, coincidentally the year Millie was born. And so he began a model using ghostwriters. And so basically he would hire a ghostwriter, provide a plot, an outline, and sometimes cast of characters, send it to the ghostwriter. They would create the manuscript, sign a release to waiving their rights to it, send it back to him. He would edit, and then he would make whatever changes he wanted to make, and then he would send it to the publisher that contracted for that series, and it would get published. And that was sort of the process. And so from 1905 on, there was a lot of different series. He's credited with starting like the Bobbsey Twins, the Rover Boys, and some of those older, old-fashioned series. And so by the mid-1920s, he was interested in creating a new girls series. And that's kind of where Millie comes into play. Here's an image from Edward back in the day in his home study. And here is the home that he lived in, taken in the modern era, you can see from the car, but this was sort of his storybook house that the family lived in at one point. But then comes Millie, and that's what really kind of added a lot of oomph to Nancy Drew. How did Millie get involved with Edward Stratemeyer? Well, she was kind of the breakout character. She was a go-getter in all of this history. She grew up, just briefly, I'll tell you a little bit about her. She grew up in Ladora, Iowa. It is a very tiny rural town. Any of those of you who grew up in a rural area will understand there was around 200 or so people in this town. It was very small, farming, ranching, different things like that. But it was a place you kind of had to make your own adventures. And this is her and her brother when she was real little. This is her childhood home in Ladora. You can barely see her, but she's standing on the front porch. When you live in a really small town, you kind of have to make your own adventures. So she was always getting into things and doing fun stuff. She loved to read. She read just about everything she could find in the town. Her dad was a country doctor, and she would ride along with him sometimes to see patients and, get to go on those adventures. And she basically started writing. She just had a real flair for writing. And as a child even, she said, "I'm going to grow up to be a great writer." And of course she did. One of her first things that was published was in St. Nicholas, which was a really neat magazine for kids. A lot of writers started out with some articles in here and went on to do a lot of things. So she submitted a piece called The Courtesy, and it was published in 1919. And she won a silver badge for it, and it just really kind of gave her a thrill. You know, she was published, she got paid for her work, and she won an award. And so it just sort of enticed her into writing more. So she began a lot of short story writing in different short story papers and things as a kid on up into her 20s. There was, like I said, she had to find adventure. A pilot landed in Ladora and was giving people rides for a small fee. And so she scraped up all her allowance that she had and ran over to where this pilot was giving little flights to. And so she paid him to take her up in this Jenny. And she had the adventure of a lifetime for a kid flying around. And she was trying to borrow and scrape up more money from people to fly again a second time when her father found out what was going on and put a stop to it. So she was stubborn and precocious. She was very precocious at that age. And so she just loved adventures. In fact, she graduated a little early from high school and headed off to State University in Iowa City. It's now the University of Iowa. And there's a postcard here of kind of the campus and city back then. She got very involved in college in sports. She was on the swim team. She was a championship diver. This is a famous picture of her doing a swan dive over the Iowa River. So she was very, very involved in activities in college. She was writing, she was on the yearbook, she worked for the student paper, and she had a famous editorial called Our Sardines that you can see at the university, and it's also digitized online. But the women had a separate pool back then from the men. But the men, naturally, had received a very fancy, new, large pool that they could practice in. But the women had a very tiny, cramped, older pool. And so she kind of was protesting the fact that they were stuck at like sardines in their pool. And of course, she, in this editorial, kind of said, you know, in spite of that handicap, they should be praised for the progress they have made. And so this was kind of a famous editorial she wrote. But how did she come to write for Edward Stratemeyer? After she graduated, she took a trip to Europe, and she came back through New York and met Edward Stratemeyer. There was an ad in the Editor. It was a literary author's weekly publication. And so Stratemeyer ran this ad, and basically it was 1926. And he was looking for writers, and he kind of put in the paragraph, he was especially interested in younger writers, those with fresh ideas. And if you could believe it, Millie and Leslie McFarlane, the early author of the Hardy Boys, both responded to this ad and got hired to work for Stratemeyer. And this is kind of how that began. And so she reached out to him at first and submitted some samples of her writing, and he didn't have anything available at that time. But soon, Ruth Fielding came to play. Now, Millie had read this series as a kid, and so it was kind of faltering. It wasn't doing too good. So he wanted to change ghostwriters and try something new. So he hired her to write the first Ruth Fielding book, Great Scenario. And she always wrote that at first, and this was her first book she wrote. And it fought her, she said the character fought her as she tried to work out the story at first. And then finally things became flowing, and it became what it ended up being. And so for several years, from the mid-1920s towards the end of 1920s, basically he was sending her manuscripts for Ruth Fielding and kind of giving her some tutelage. He was kind of like a mentor, and she was like a mentee. He would give her advice and kind of tell her how she should write this. She sort of learned that Stratemeyer formula. And it was a very professional and friendly relationship back and forth. When you look at the letters, there are a bunch of letters in the New York Public Library. At their Manuscripts and Archives division, you can go and look through nearly 400 boxes of Stratemeyer materials if you want to delve into all these neat letters and things behind the scenes. I've spent quite a few trips going there and looking at things, but their relationship was professional and cordial, and you know, he was very friendly and he was very helpful to her, and he sort of guided her writing in the beginning and helped her sort of form her style. Outside of that St. Nicholas style, she also picked up on writing stories for them. This is her author's copy, which is at the University of Iowa. Once her daughter passed away, her whole entire author's collection went to the University of Iowa. It's the Women's Archive. And so she wrote, you know, that it was her author's copy. This is the first published book I ever wrote. And so she wrote some things in her author's copies that are really neat. So, like I mentioned, Edward Stratemeyer was trying to figure out a new girls series, something more up-to-date and bright about this neat teenage American detective. And he was formulating ideas. He was talking to different publishers. He's talked to a publisher named Barnes and Hopkins in the mid-20s, trying to kind of pitch a loose idea of what would become Nancy Drew. And they weren't really interested. But by 1929, Grosset and Dunlap, who published all the Nancy Drew books in the classic series, 1 through 56, they were interested, and he had kind of got more of a formal proposal together for them. She wasn't even Nancy Drew necessarily. She could have been Stella Strong. That was a suggested name for her. And so they gave the green light for the series, and so Stratemeyer sent Millie a letter asking if she'd be willing to write for this new series. And she was really actually thrilled to start a new series fresh. Although I think she liked Ruth Fielding okay, it didn't quite resonate with her necessarily. So you'll never see this anywhere publicly, at least not right now, though I'm going to make sure copies come here. This is a copy of the original outline Millie received for The Old Clock. It is 1, 2, 3.5 typewritten pages. And it wasn't, as you can see, chapter by chapter. It was kind of a loose sort of proposal. And then the chapters would get figured out as she wrote the book. It was a 25-chapter book. And he had some instructions for her and how to return it with this outline with the manuscript. They always return the outline. And it's not in the New York Public Library. There's a nice little mystery of why all the original Nancy Drew outlines are not there. There are outlines for revised books and later books, but not any of the early ones. So this is a pretty neat thing. We have copies of the first 3, and that's it. So we don't know what the other outlines look like. But it does give you a sense of what was Stratemeyer's ideas and then how Millie turned that into the book. Alana Nash wrote an article for Dime Novel Roundup about this particular outline. And she kind of, just for perspective's sake, the outline, if you turned it into book-size pages, because the book was over 200 pages, is about 10 Nancy Drew book-size pages. So the writing that went into this was about 200 plus pages that Mildred fleshed this out into, and then some. When she finished this particular book, she had to sign a release. And this is the release, and this is in the New York Public Library. All of her releases for all the different books she wrote for him are there. And as you can see, the release isn't very long. It's very simple. It was dated in November of 1929. She spent basically from October into the spring writing the first 3 books that were published. And so it basically just signs away the right, transfers to him as a literary agent, and his heirs are assigned all the right title interest in a certain story written by me on a title and complete working outline furnished by said Edward Stratemeyer and named. And so it lists The Secret of the Old Clock, and she verifies the story is new, grants him full permission to print the story under any trademark pen name, and agrees she will not use the pen name in any manner whatsoever. There was no secrecy clause. It kind of sounds dramatic and fun when people write articles about this, that she was bound by secrecy. She basically just couldn't write other Nancy Drew stories using the characters, and she couldn't use the pen name and things like that. And I think Edward Stratemeyer basically expected his writers not to go blabbing it out to the public of who they were, because he wanted that pseudonym to kind of give a sense of this is the person writing these books, especially if they changed ghostwriters. And so, the continuity of that, and not know that this person or that person is writing it. And for the most part, his ghostwriters didn't go out and announce publicly who they were. Sometimes in a local paper or an author's reference biography or book, there might be a mention of some things, but it wasn't like they held a press conference and just, said, oh, I am Carolyn Keene. So anyhow, it's interesting to look at the old release. The first 3 books were published April 28, 1930. So Monday will be the official anniversary. Once these were published, of course, nobody knew at that time how popular Nancy Drew would be all these years later and what would be to come. But less than 2 weeks later, tragically, Edward Stratemeyer passed away. And here is sort of the Newark Sunday Call, a New Jersey paper that ran an obit, an article about his death. Thanks to James Keyline for sending me this. For those of you who don't know, James Keyline is our resident Stratemeyer expert. He's kind of like a superhuman computer of Stratemeyer facts. You ask him any question and he can just bring up a whole bunch of information for you. He's really good about that. So Edward Stratemeyer basically passed away, and it left everything kind of in turmoil. There was a lot of drama to come for a bit. Here's his gravestone in New Jersey. With tender devotion, we turn the last page. The final chapter closes, leaving in young hearts and it goes on, it's buried by the dirt. It goes on to talk about fine ideals. So when he passed away, Millie received a letter from his assistant, Harriet Otis Smith, about the passing of Edward. And he had died of pneumonia and complications related to that. And so she wrote Millie about this and basically asked her to finish what she was working on, and they would kind of go from there. And then there was another letter to her talking about more about what was going on with the syndicate and the next stories in the series that had been worked on. So Edward basically outlined the first 3, edited those. He outlined the 4th book, Lilac Inn, and they worked on some of that. But Shadow Ranch, the 5th book, he kind of had started, but nothing had been completed. So his assistant basically had to step in and finish the outline, probably created the characters of Bess and George. Helen kind of went by the wayside, her friend from earlier books for the most part. And so these are just a couple of letters from the New York Public Library about the syndicate and what's going on and the legal matters and what they're doing about that. Basically, as all of this was going on, just right before that, for those of you who remember history, near the end of 1929, we had the stock market crash in October of 29. And that kind of started the Great Depression period in our country. So there was a lot of things going on in the world and behind the scenes. But when Edward died, what are we going to do with the syndicate? The publishers were anxious. They didn't know what was going to happen. And so the daughters, his wife was sort of an invalid and very ill. So his daughters, Harriet and Edna, were left to kind of deal with the estate and the business. And they thought they would sell it. They didn't really have an idea in their mind that they would stay on. This young man was named Wallace Palmer. He was a huge super fan of Edward Stratemeyer, and James Keyline has written about him and has some information on him on his website, and that's where I got this image. But Wallace, and this is from James's website, he was a very enthusiastic collector of Stratemeyer's books. He wrote to Edward quite a few times. He visited. He's kind of like us when we went to see Millie in 2001. He was just very interested in the whole process and the books. And so he was very interested, and he also kind of wanted to write a book about all of this, but he was very interested in purchasing the syndicate. But unfortunately, the sisters really didn't take him seriously. And as you can see, he was about 10 years old also in this photo. Maybe that's why they didn't take him serious. Just kidding. So basically, they turned him down. They couldn't find a suitable buyer. They even tried to run an ad to try to sell it. But they kind of ran this strangely secretive ad where they didn't mention the Stratemeyer syndicate. They just said a profitable company, and nobody really responded. So here we have his daughters, Harriet on the left at her farm, and then Edna on the right with her dad, Edward. And these were the two sisters that got to tackle the syndicate and all of the series and kind of move forward. Edna was quoted as saying, "In spite of ourselves, it looks as if we must carry on." Edna was the younger daughter. Her sister Harriet had gone to Wellesley. She had married and had kids. And Edna kind of went a little bit to boarding school, but she just was a little more of a free spirit, I think, than Harriet. And so she is actually the one who worked more on Nancy Drew in the 1930s after Edward died than Harriet. Harriet was a little bit involved, but Edna wrote most of the outlines for the books in the 1930s. And then for the books Millie wrote, starting with Redgate Farm. Edna was a little bit into mysticism and spiritualism, and so some of the plots from some of her books are a little more unusual. So they take over the running of the syndicate. And it was very, very unusual for two women in the 1930s, especially, and during the Depression, to be running a company like this. Publishing at that time was very male-dominated, and so they were an interesting splash of womanhood into the publishing industry and dealing with these publishers. They were very different from their father in some ways, but the publishers basically wanted them to continue using the existing ghostwriters that were writing for the company because they were working out very well, and that kind of helped them transition without having to worry about hiring people and figuring out what to do. His assistant, Harriet Otis Smith, helped prepare them to run this company over a few months. They moved the company from New York to New Jersey. Harriet did not want to commute to New Jersey, so she left the company. And basically by the fall of 1930, the sisters were kind of on their own at this point. By 1934, fast forwarding a few years, the Nancy Drew series, even through the Depression, was outselling the boys series. It was doing so well. And Fortune magazine had a great article about Stratemeyer and the syndicate, and they go into kind of how popular Nancy Drew had become at this point, which gets me to my slide about the Drew team, what I call the people that were involved first on from Nancy Drew in the beginning, that kind of set the foundation for how popular Nancy Drew would be and kind of set the tone for what was to come all these years. And so, just briefly, the Drew team consists of Edward, top left, Millie, second, Russell Tandy, the first illustrator, is third from left, and on the end, Edna. Middle left is Harriet. Middle right is a model named Grace Horton. She wasn't the first model for Nancy Drew, but she came in a little bit later into it in the mid-30s, and for a few years through what Tandy illustrated. And then the bottom left is kind of a fuzzy picture of Harriet Otis Smith that I got from James Keyline. There's not really many photos of her, but that's what she looked like. And then next to her is, of course, our seasoned Navy man, Walter Carrig, who stepped in the 1930s, and you're going to hear a little bit more about that tomorrow in my talk, and wrote 3 books when Millie refused to take a pay cut during the Depression, when they wanted her to take a pay cut. So he wrote books 8 to 10. And then, of course, next to him are Alexander Grosset and George Dunlap, publishers of Grosset and Dunlap. So I call them the Drew team because they all came together at the same time to work on what would become a hugely successful series that I don't think any of them thought at the time would still be in print today, which is pretty amazing. So by the mid-30s, as I noted, she was selling better than the boys series at the time, and was very, very popular among readers, and very popular through a very hard period of time for businesses. During the Depression, there were a lot of series books that kind of went out of print and faltered because they weren't having good sales. But I think, Nancy Drew was basically, she was very different from those namby-pamby, as Millie would call them. She was bold, she was daring, she was out there having adventures and doing things that girls dreamed of, and boys. And she was making her way in the world. She was respected by authority figures for the most part. And she was a lot more brash and bold and a little wilder in those Millie books until Harriet got more involved by the early 40s onward and kind of toned her down a bit. And so Anyhow, these are the people that basically we can credit with the beginning and setting that great foundation. Edna left the syndicate at the end of the 1930s, early 40s, because she moved to Florida with her husband. And she kind of became a silent partner for a while, to Harriet's aggravation, trying to deal with her back and forth from New Jersey to Florida. Edna could be kind of difficult. But so could Harriet. She was very stubborn. And so Harriet kind of took on the day-to-day running of the syndicate and got more involved with Nancy Drew and other series. And so Harriet takes us from the Depression years, which amazingly Nancy Drew did very well, into the war years of the 40s. And those were a little hard on publishing because of the paper. They had to basically ration paper. You know, there was people saving scrap metals, paper, rubber, rags, you name it, for victory. And so a lot of the books were printed on very, very cheap pulp paper, which has not aged well. So a lot of 1940s printings of Nancy Drew and other series books, you'll find very tanned pages that are very brittle and crumbly, and so they're not the best quality during that era. And the books would carry a notice that said, "This book, while produced under wartime conditions in full compliance with governmental regulations for the conservation of paper and other essential materials, is complete and unabridged." And so for several years, that notice ran in the books. So Harriet took us through the war years into the 50s, where people, especially women who went to work in the 40s, and when the men went to war, kind of became a little more domestic in the 50s, kind of came back to the home, some of them. Not Millie, of course, she was out there shaking down people in local government here and following the courthouse beats. But so we got through the 50s and the 60s and the 70s, and then we get to the end of the 70s, and Harriet has a lot to contend with in her later years, in the few years before she passed away. She decided to switch publishers from Grosset and Dunlap to Simon & Schuster for various reasons. The biggest one was royalties. They had really never renegotiated royalties, and Grosset had kind of held them to the old days from the 30s. So they weren't getting paid as much on these books as they really should have. Grosset and Dunlap did not really make plans for Nancy's 50th birthday or anniversary, which upset Harriet, because at that time, by this point, Harriet kind of considered Nancy like a daughter. Harriet kind of followed that Wellesley motto and felt like Nancy Drew should as well. And she was very upset that there wasn't going to be any big fanfare for Nancy Drew. And of course, Simon & Schuster had been kind of courting her, wanting to publish these books. And so she switched publishers, which of course upset Grosset and Dunlap. And they filed suit, trying to establish copyright over the series so they could be continuing to publish these books. So in 1980, when Nancy was celebrating her 50th anniversary, they were in court, the syndicate and Simon & Schuster both being sued by Grosset in district court in New York. And, you know, going through the whole legalese, I won't get into that, but basically, as I said, Grosset wanted to try to establish copyright on the series because they provided the artwork and did other things like editing on these books as well. And so they presented their case, the other side presented their case. Millie had been in talks with them at the time, Grosset, about reissuing some of her Penny Parker series books. They had acquired from publishers that had gone out of print, that had acquired from other publishers from back when they were published. And they were interested in Penny Parker, especially if they lost Nancy Drew in the lawsuit. And so she's talking to them, and she goes, "You know, I wrote the original Nancy Drew books." And Grosset, the people at Grosset at the time had no clue. And so they brought her into trial to try to help their case. And so she appeared in district court. This was the first time she ever appeared on the record to talk about her involvement in all those years ago. And there's a famous thing that one of our collecting group, his name is Jeffrey Lapin. He helped kind of establish Millie publicly as writing these books. He worked for years to sort of get her recognition for what she had done. He was involved too in the lawsuit side of things, providing information to Grosset. And so he was there with her at the court, and Harriet walked in and just kind of saw Millie and kind of was startled and exclaimed, "I thought you were dead." So there was some drama with his trial, but it didn't get published. I mean, there was articles published about the trial, but they didn't go into Millie, oh, this woman came to the stand and they thought she was dead and she said she wrote all these books. That wasn't published. Like, nobody publicly talked about it. But it was on the record, the official trial transcript about what she did. There was, some of those artifacts that are in the New York Public Library were presented as evidence and showing her signing these releases and writing these books. But the end result of this trial was basically they didn't get to establish copyright over these books, but the judge gave Grosset the right to keep reprinting the first 56 books that they had always published. So Simon & Schuster and the syndicate got to do whatever they wanted with the rest of the books onward. And so that's kind of how it ended. I think Grosset got a good deal out of it because the classic 56 are the ones that most people still talk about today and still read and pass down and are still in print, except for the original text versions. So as I mentioned, Nancy turned 50, and pretty soon after that, Harriet passed away. And then a couple years after that, Simon & Schuster bought the syndicate from the remaining syndicate partners and her family. And then we kind of had this period of time where there are factions in the collecting world, which I will not go into all of that, but some support Millie, some support Harriet and the syndicate. I don't see any reason to pick a side. They all did an amazing job all of these years producing all these books, and they all contributed a lot to all of this. And so these are Harriet and Millie, of course, sitting there. And here's Jeff. He wrote an article about Millie. It was published in Books at Iowa, and this is him with Leslie Garris, granddaughter of Howard Garris, who was a prolific ghostwriter for the syndicate, Tom Swift and other books. Here's Harriet's obituary when she died. And Simon & Schuster, of course, 2 years later, purchased the syndicate. So Simon & Schuster became basically the owner of everything, the whole syndicate catalog. And so they get to publish all the new books and change things up and do whatever they want. They get to license Nancy Drew for other companies, take the brand and create products or movies or television and things like that. By the 1990s, because when Harriet died and the 50th anniversary was happening and the trial, there was a lot of publicity out there about Nancy Drew and these books and the syndicate. And so Harriet would claim that she wrote all these books, even though she didn't actually write all these books, and wasn't that heavily involved in the 1930s when Nancy became so popular. It was her sister Edna who kind of got left out of that sort of history. And so I'm trying to do my part to get Edna more recognition for what she did, but that kind of blanketed the country. And that was another reason Millie really wanted to testify, because she was a journalist and she believed in honesty and integrity in journalism and telling the facts, not saying your opinion and what you think everybody else should think about an issue, but just getting the story out there and giving you all the facts to make up your own mind about whatever she's writing about. And that was kind of the type of journalist she was. And when she would see these articles claiming that other people wrote what she wrote, it was upsetting to her. And so she wanted to go on the record with the trial. She had brought a briefcase with her with articles she was seeing out there in New York Times, other places, that upset her. And she had brought those to court and kind of pulled them out of the briefcase. But the tide kind of changed once Harriet passed, once Simon & Schuster got a hold of the syndicate and continued on. Harriet kind of fell by the wayside a little bit, and the media started to talk about Millie by 1993. There was a Nancy Drew conference in Iowa, and at her university, and they honored her and decided to have this huge conference. 500 people attended this thing, came from all over other countries. The media was amazing because one of the organizers, Carolyn Stewart Dyer, was a journalist and a professor of journalism there. And so she had a lot of media contacts as well as the university. So they got the media really involved. There were women everywhere that remembered reading Nancy Drew and they wanted to write stories. Millie got on television as ABC's Person of the Week with Peter Jennings. I mean, it was very overwhelming for her. It was an honor. It was nice for her. It was incredibly overwhelming from that point onward for her. At this point, she was in her mid to late 80s when this was going on. And so the tide shifted. And I can understand why some people might say it shifted too much in her direction. But that's the nature of media and people who don't understand the history and don't know about Edward and don't know about Harriet. And they're just writing an article on what's going on. Following the conference, the New York Public Library got the donation from Simon & Schuster of all the Stratemeyer Syndicate archive that they had acquired, all of the old letters, outlines, manuscripts, all kinds of interesting things, advertising materials. It's just a whole plethora of really fun and unique things that they have. And they donated to the New York Public Library. But it took a little while before it opened to the public because they had to raise funding. It didn't come with funding, just the items. And for New York Public Library, they need funding. And so they had several researchers, including James Keyline, got together with the son of one of the syndicate ghostwriters who worked for an insurance company called Chubb Insurance. And they kind of all got together, created this project, and they got the funding from the insurance company. I think it was $75,000. And that was what was paid to someone to go in and go through all these boxes and archive them for the library. And so finally, after a few years, researchers and people were able to access all of this stuff. And it changed a lot of the ways that we looked at the history of Nancy Drew and all these other series books, because you got to see the releases of who wrote what. You got to see letters between different ghostwriters and other publishers with the syndicate, and you got to learn a lot about what was going on behind the scenes, because for years there was what we called syndicate publicity, which was put out, which didn't necessarily include all of the facts. And so it changed publications that had been published, books about the syndicate, where they had errors because nobody knew all of this stuff. So that was really interesting, what that kind of opened up. And so from then on, from the 90s on, there's been a lot of reflection among people about Nancy Drew because she got so much publicity at that time. And Millie was honored, and the donation and all of the archives opening up. And people started really collecting Nancy Drew, especially in the 80s. People were really getting into collecting Nancy Drew, and she was becoming more of a mainstream collecting item among the collecting community. People were going book hunting, and they were acquiring all of these things. And so people began to be nostalgic about Nancy Drew. They began to write articles and essays, and you saw all sorts of interesting things like that out in the world. Collectors were starting to form little groups, and things were happening. And people reflected on Nancy Drew, that she was a role model, that she was a heroine to them, that she meant so much when they read these books as kids. Some of our Supreme Court justices, I love mentioning this, the women have noted she was a big inspiration to them. So you were getting all this inspiration about Nancy Drew and nostalgia from all different walks of life and levels. And so Harriet, I mentioned the Wellesley model. Now, I hope I don't butcher this, but non ministrare sed ministrar, not to be ministered unto, but to minister. And so for Harriet, that was a big deal. And she kind of saw Nancy Drew as being this role model, and who would follow this kind of model in everything that she did and all the stories and everything. And Harriet kind of carried that as her banner all those years. And then we had Millie, who was a little bit different than Harriet. She didn't go to a school like Wellesley. She was more kind of rough and tumble. And Millie wrote in later life, "Now, so much later in my life, women still tell me how they identified with Nancy Drew and that Nancy Drew gave them confidence to be whatever they wanted to be. That's been the most rewarding aspect." The thing about Millie is she didn't fuss about things. She was stubborn. She kind of told it how it was. She was a little bit like George. Maybe not as bad, but maybe a little bit. But that's George is the character in the books, if you didn't know that. But yeah, so Millie, she didn't understand when all of this was happening, and she started getting all this recognition, and fans were wanting to meet her and have her sign books. And this was a job for her back in the day. People talk about what she was paid for the original books, $125 at first. And how, oh my gosh, she was only paid $125, and look at all this money this is made for these publishers all these years later. But at the time, that was really not a bad payment. It was considered to be the equivalent of a couple of months of salary for just a few weeks of work. So it was kind of lucrative to get this kind of assignment, because they could make quite a bit of extra money in addition to their regular jobs if they had regular jobs at the time. So it was actually a very good gig to get to be a ghostwriter for the syndicate. And she kind of considered it just like, it was just work at the time. No, like I said, nobody knew what this was going to become all these years later. And so she didn't really get what the fuss was about sometimes. She kind of got it, but she didn't, It was just her job, she didn't realize. But as she talked to fans and read things that fans were writing about these books, I think she kind of came to respect the fact that women were very inspired, and men too, from reading these books, and that they meant something to people and changed their lives in some ways. And you wouldn't think a fictional girl detective could do that, but Nancy just really resonated with people over the years. And of course, Nancy lives on in fans, like our group and other fans out there. So I'm just gonna breeze through a few photos of our fan group. We have a big thing we like to do, which is donate books to libraries, because we want kids to keep reading these books. And we want them to get hooked on reading through these books, because that's very important. This particular image is from San Diego, when we donated a full set of the classic books and a few of the newer covers they did for a special thing. But we donate books to libraries every year, usually where we have a convention. We'll donate books to the library. We also visited the Iowa Women's Archive here in this photo, where you can see Millie's author's copies on a cart before a special shelf was built for them. The organizers of the conference on the right, Carolyn Stewart Dyer and Nancy Romanoff, she was really a neat woman too, and they both came together with the university and just put on a phenomenal conference that just celebrated all aspects of Nancy Drew and Millie, and really helped this archive grow of Millie's papers and what was to come later. And of course, we dedicate a lot here in Toledo to Nancy Drew and Millie. There's Nancy and I with the literary landmark. That was really neat that they dedicated to Millie. And then of course, my collection is here. We hope to kind of inspire people through that collection, and get more readers interested in Nancy Drew, and give fans more nostalgia for what they read. And of course, we have visited Stratemeyer's grave on some of our adventures that took us to New Jersey. So we just kind of keep the history alive, a lot of us, by coming to these events, by talking about it. That's kind of my big thing, is the history behind the mystery, is what I find most fascinating. Even, I love the books and all of that comes with it in the collecting, but I really love the research and the history behind it, because if you don't celebrate that, if you don't talk about it, it can get buried and people don't learn and grow from it. And so it's important to me to really put that out there. And so Nancy Drew has been empowering kids and adults for over 90 years. She's a pop culture icon. Mystery's it girl, passed down from generations among fans of the books. Mystery authors cite her as an influence, and so do women of law enforcement, attorneys, women on the US Supreme Court. It's a legacy that will always be a force to be reckoned with among the generations, a legacy that exists inside us and in the promise for a better future among the new generations of Nancy Drew readers. It's what binds us all together despite our differences. Inspiration for the masses, nostalgia tried and true, and infinitely timeless. And that's true about Nancy. She's just incredibly timeless, as is her history. And briefly, here is a slide just with resources, and they're on that sheet of paper you have in your folder. If you want to learn more about the history of Nancy Drew, and there's a lot to it that I didn't even barely touch the surface on. There's some things listed here, and also James Keyline's website has a lot of information on Stratemeyer at stratemeyer.org. So I'm going to move on to collecting, and this is going to be a fairly quick one. But if you look in your folder, what goes with the collecting is this little graphic, and it's a poster that I created to help a lot of fans just at a glance, rather than having to dig through a website, because I have all of this information on my website more fleshed out. But if you held up a Nancy Drew book and said, what is this? When is it from? You can basically visually look at it and look at the poster and say, okay, does it have a white spine, a wrap spine? Is it just a blue book underneath? Does it not have a dust jacket, but it's a blue book? Is it a yellow spine picture cover? A flashlight edition? And so you can kind of match it to what's on here and see what era and what time period your format that you're holding comes from. which helps you narrow down about the age of it. It also kind of talks to you about, as a general rule, if you look at the last listed Nancy Drew book, on dust jacket flap or on the back of a cover or inside the back of the book, when that book was published is generally the time frame that your book was published. And then if you have something that doesn't match all of that, like a paperback or a library edition, a foreign edition, a book club edition, or maybe an Applewood Books reprint, then you kind of know that it's not part of the main series in that format, but you kind of get an idea of what it is. Now this is basically covering the first 56 books, and it's got tips on how to figure out if you have a original or revised book, and more resources you can look into. So anyhow, I think it's a very handy, succinct way of figuring out what you have. It might not tell you the month or day the book was published. It doesn't give values, but it's a good guide, and you can learn even more at my website. So we're going to talk about collecting Nancy Drew 101. Basically, once upon a time when I was 3 years old, no, I'm just kidding, I didn't really consider myself a collector, but I had these books when I was a kid. You can see bottom right, I have a little tiny little shelf my grandpa built me that I put my few yellow spine books that I had at the time. By college, I had brought my childhood books. You don't see my files in here, but you see yellow spines and some Wanderer and Minstrel paperbacks. And then you see some blue ones tucked in. Well, I started visiting antique malls and used bookstores by the 90s and was picking up stuff that I didn't have as a kid because I read a lot of these books at my school library. And so I have a fondness for library editions because of that. So I didn't have a full set. So it was my goal in the 90s to kind of try to get a full set of all these books once I realized what was out there and what had been going on all these years before I was reading them. Some of you will recognize the Nancy Drew scrapbook. This was one of my first forays into something big in collecting in the around 97 or 98. I picked this up and read it by Karen Plunkett Powell, and that was a real big deal back then for collectors. It was the first book like this that went into collecting and showcased collectibles and talked about the different types of collectibles in the books and the people behind the series. So for a new collector, someone who transitioned from just being a fan or loving these books to try to actually collect the books, this was almost like a holy grail in a way back then. It was really a neat resource. And this is my collection now at home. I've been building a set. I know I donated all of that, but then I wanted to have one of each book for reading, projects, research, and things like that. So I've been slowly collecting the modern, but I've collected back the vintage and a few odds and ends to go with it. But when you're starting to collect and put together a collection like this, it helps to have information to know what you have. So here's that image again of what you have in your folder. At my website, there are a lot of collecting tips in the collecting section. And these are just 5 basic ones. And that poster kind of covers some of this, trying to figure out when they're printed and what formats they've gone through. The copyright red herring is another one. Just because it says 1930 on the copyright page doesn't mean that it's actually printed in 1930. They never changed the copyright date unless a book was revised or something was substantial about it. So don't go by the copyright. How to determine an original from revised. The first 34 books were revised in the 50s through the 70s, and they have 20 chapters now. They originally had 25. Books 35 through 56 always had 20 chapters. They were never revised. So that's a tip on that. Also, if you're wanting books in dust jacket, only the first 38 came out in dust jacket. 39 to 56 were yellow spine picture covers. And is it rare? Sometimes we think we have something that's really rare, and it's probably not that rare. There's not a whole lot in Nancy Drew that's seriously rare, but there's a lot of scarce items that come up for sale. So just quickly, I'm going to show a few images from my website where you can go into the Collecting 101 section, and you can break it down. It's by dust jacket, boards, picture covers, end papers, and on and on. And then you click in these sections and you will find a guide and information about what time periods these formats came out in, to help you figure out what you have. And it kind of goes along with the poster. The poster is sort of like just an at-a-glance way of doing it. But you can go through the website and look at all the different types of Nancy Drew books. You can see all the cover art in the library section. For the classic section, I show all of the cover art from earliest to latest. You can see all those variations. I have lots of charts that will tell you something about what something came out in this time period or what books it you can find, the Digger end papers, for instance. And then I go into other types of books besides the regularly published ones, like library editions, book club editions, foreign editions, the Applewood versions. And so you can basically get a sense of what there is out there as far as the books go, the formats, and what you can collect. Now, where to find the books? Basically, you can go book hunting. That's always fun, right? I hope some of you have gotten a chance to do some book hunting or antiquing here. This is an image from our first convention here, 2001, where Rick took us down to Tiffin to a really cool bookstore that used to be there called My Book House. And it was kind of rivaled Betsy's bookstore in Savannah now that a lot of us go to. Might have even been a little bigger, but just wall to wall, room to room of series books. And it was run by a couple of collectors, so they really focused on these particular books. So we were all there finding something, and it looks like I was finding the Bonita Granville tie-in book. They used a lot of the Hollywood actresses to write these little mystery stories, and so it's not necessarily related to Nancy Drew, but it was a tie-in. Here's our resident Dean Burcham, part of the collecting group, who loves to go book hunting. I think this was in Charlottesville, but it's always fun to go book hunting with your friends and collectors at these events. Here we are in Boston doing some book hunting. And sometimes book hunting can get a little wild and crazy though when you're with your friends. So you gotta watch out. Sometimes it's better to go by yourself. But if you wanna know where to find these books, I would suggest used bookstores, antiquarian bookstores. Antique malls are great. They can be hit and miss, but sometimes you'll have a book vendor in them. Websites like eBay, and there's other places where people sell stuff like Etsy, Facebook Marketplace. Is Craigslist even a thing anymore? People used to sell on there years ago. Garage sales, flea markets, you name it. Just get out there and have fun and be on the hunt and kind of play Nancy Drew, and that's kind of what I recommend. My collecting section has some tips for you on kind of how to find these books and online sites you can visit. My collection that exists over there and then down in the archive, what you don't see that's here, I put together probably over 90% of that using eBay. eBay used to be more of a big spot for a lot of really neat collectibles you don't necessarily see today, back in its heyday of the late 90s, early 2000s, before some things changed. But I would recommend that. And if you're going to collect collectibles, now some of you may just focus more on the books, and the collectibles don't matter as much to you. But for someone like me, it's everything Nancy Drew. I mean, if they put Nancy Drew's name on a tire, I might not buy that, but I might think about it. I don't know. The Nancy Drew tires for your Roadster series. But I collected anything Nancy Drew, but I break down on my website in the collectibles section, Nancy Drew collectibles in categories of movie collectibles, book collectibles, television collectibles, and then kind of modern collectibles or merchandise, which is a lot of the stuff that beginning in the early 2000s, Simon & Schuster began to try to merchandise more because Harriet was very strict at the syndicate. She didn't just like anybody to do anything with Nancy Drew especially. She was very strict. So there wasn't a whole lot of licensing and branding back in the Harriet era. A little bit here and there, and a lot more around the time the 70s shows came out. But she, as I said, was strict. And so I think that kind of hurt the brand a little bit because it wasn't out there everywhere. And so Simon & Schuster's kind of tried to turn that around and get the brand out there a little bit more. So I kind of saved from the early 2000s onward is what I would consider modern collectibles and merchandise. You can see some collectibles along the shelves that I used to have at home of all of this. And if you go over to the collection over there, you can obviously in the back area of the room see quite a few of the collectibles. Those drawers, if you haven't pulled them out, are kind of categorized by different types of things like book club memorabilia, fan club memorabilia, TV memorabilia, some movie. And they all have their own little drawers where everything is categorized, which is fun. So you can get a good idea of those kind of collectibles. Here's some movie collectibles, lobby cards and stills. Another movie poster from a more modern movie from the 70s shows some TV collectibles, stills, and signed photos. And then we had some fun things over the years. There was a mystery game that has 2 different board box covers and a costume from the 70s show. We had Madame Alexander doing dolls. We had a cookbook, a diary, the part of the modern era of Nancy Drew computer games from Her Interactive. There's lots of games. There's cereal. This is in the room over there in a frame, a cereal box, and they had these neat cereal premiums that you could get in boxes. And so there's a drawer over there with all of the cereal premiums that go with this box. There was a date book and homework planner, which is very hard to find. There was a lunchbox from the television show. And then I'm going to show you kind of a little bit about what's in the drawers over there. There's some movie stuff. There's a television related fan club. And there was a watch, Pamela Sue Martin watch. Fan clubs have art, buttons. There are advertisements that advertise these books that I collected. Those little cartoon premium booklets. There was a mystery reporter fan club that you could join back in the early 80s, and you got a membership card. There are like promotional cover flats and bookmarks for other spin-off series. And just some of the modern stuff you can find, a bookmark, a passport case, puzzles, all sorts of fun things. There was book club memorabilia for the Cameo Book Club. We even have some items from some of our conventions and things that we've done over the years. The 2007 Emma Roberts movie, there's some promotional items from that. And there's also a drawer with some handmade Nancy Drew items. These aren't really officially licensed. These were things that fans kind of created and maybe gave in gift exchanges. My mom beaded the necklace on the left for me, and I made these little charms that went on it. And so just little fun things like that you can find over there. And so I also have a Pinterest page, and I'll show you that screen in a minute. If you're on Pinterest, I have created dozens of boards on all these different categories that you can go to. So if you want to see all the movie collectibles that I have or what's out there to collect, it's basically a resource for myself when I'm out running around and I'm like, do I have that? And so I'll go to my Pinterest and like, okay, yeah, I have that version. It's very helpful for me, but it's also kind of a guide for you guys because you can see all the things, you know, you want to collect. You can go home and sit there and go through it and kind of figure out what you'd like to look for, because it is fun to sleuth for these things. Some items are a little scarce, but you know, they're always going to turn up at some point. Recently, I sent 7 boxes here to the library in the last several weeks of more donations. Since the last time I was here, I keep collecting for the collection because I donated it when I was about 20. I still had more to collect. I had a lot of the basic stuff, all the books and things, but I basically didn't have quite everything. So there are items that I don't have that I will try to collect for the collection still yet, including foreign editions and library editions, which I didn't have complete sets of. So I sent a lot of foreign editions and library editions with those boxes. And so these are just some examples of what I just sent, of some of the foreign editions. In the case in there by where everybody ate last night, there is a People magazine article on Millie that she signed that I acquired and donated. There's a cool notebook from the Nancy Drew Notebooks promotional stuff that was going on when that series was published. Another photo from the 70s show. There was a Hallmark greeting card I never knew about. Which basically is kind of funny. It's, why do you think we grew up feeling we had to be perfect in every area of our lives? And you open it up and it says, I blame it on all those Nancy Drew books. So that was kind of funny. I stumbled across that. A press photo of Harriet I donated. There was an action figure campaign, some of those modern collectibles. And so I bought a full set of everything in the campaign, all the action figures and everything. And for the library to have. And so this is one of those from Old Clock. But we never had Nancy Drew action figures growing up until the last year when they had a Kickstarter campaign. TV cards from Mexico when the 70s show was airing. There's a form letter after the conference. Millie was so overwhelmed with people visiting and sending letters and things like that. She got to where she just couldn't respond. And then she had some macular degeneration going on and couldn't see very well and had a hard time seeing and doing these kinds of tasks. So they created a form, kind of a form letter they made copies of at one point. And so when people would write to her, they would mail them a copy of this back, where she mentions getting their letter and thanking them for their kind comments. Of course, what if it was mailed back to someone who didn't have kind comments? But it brings her pleasure to be remembered, and it goes on. And so people would get this back in the mail. I don't suppose any of you wrote to Millie during this time period and got one of these back by chance, but anyhow, they now have a copy of that for the archive. There were these Caro's restaurant, Nancy Drew, what they called cogs, like a pog that kids could collect, and there was a series of detectives. So there were Nancy Drew ones, a television card, there was a hat for one of the Nancy Drew movies, a script from the CW show, and quite a few things from that. This is just a small sampling of what I sent. I mentioned my Pinterest page that you can go to, and this is kind of a glance of all the different boards. So it's a good resource to see. A lot of this is what I have here, the collection, but some items have been newly acquired and I need to update it some more. But that gives you kind of an overview of the collectibles. So we've kind of covered formats of books and collectibles and what's out there. And it is kind of overwhelming. When I donated my collection, I honestly was feeling overwhelmed because I had so many items and I had limited shelves and I had stuff being stored, and I couldn't store these collectible items very easily. They don't necessarily fit well on a shelf. So I was feeling overwhelmed trying to archive it and store it, and that was another reason I felt really good about donating it, so it could be better archived and stored and have a purpose here. And so anyhow, that is both of my presentations for history and collecting. Really quick, I want to go over the bingo card, and then I want to present something important. We're going to do a little presentation and then we'll be done. This bingo card is just kind of a little challenge. Head over to the Nancy Drew room during the lunch break and see if you can fill it out and look for things. It's just sleuth around, put your name on it. And so I'll know who did it, and you can turn them into me here in the auditorium when we come in for the movie. And after the movie's over, we will draw from fully completed cards for some prizes. We have one of our handbags, and there's some more prizes inside here I'm going to give away. So we're going to be doing that, and that'll be fun, I think. So this is just collecting resources, and they're on the handout that you have in your packet. So that is my presentation, and just briefly before I do my little presentation, does anybody have any questions?
When is your book being published?
Oh, and Millie? Oh, that's an interesting story. So let's just say that I do have an agent now. She used to work for Simon & Schuster. She used to be one of their licensing agents. So that's been great. I have her on board. I'm still working on it. The problem with me is I want it to be perfectly perfect, and I know at some point it just needs to be published. I can't get everything that should go in there, and I can't put everything in there. I could probably write several books on her. But there is a little bit of research that's being hoarded by some people, not the people I'm talking about with the documents. That this is something completely different. That would be very important for this biography, and I kind of keep hoping it'll become available, and I'm not so sure it ever will, because there are some gaps at the New York Public Library where there are some things that are missing that didn't get donated, but what she had in her possession would fill in those gaps, and these items went to somebody, and they don't really want to share them with anybody, so it's been frustrating. And then I get busy with conventions and things, and I kind of set it aside. So I work on it a little bit and get back to it. But I kind of hope to get it done this year. But this year with the anniversary, there's just been so much going on, and we have a convention in October that I think next year will be the time I wrap it up, because we only have one event next fall of next year. So I'll have a lot more time to try to wrap it up. So that's my hope. And so I have an agent, and I'm hoping Simon & Schuster is interested in it. it'd be really easy to work with them because we already do. There's also Grosset and Dunlap, which is now under Penguin Random House. And I know them fairly well too. So hopefully one of them will be interested in this. So yeah, anybody else?
Do you have any plans to write a Nancy Drew's Adventures World?
Do I have plans to write a Nancy Drew book? That's an interesting question. I have thought about that over the years, maybe moving into fiction writing. It's a lot harder in some ways than nonfiction writing, and it would be cool. It would kind of be a dream to be able to write a Nancy Drew book, but not right now. Not right now, but maybe someday I'll think about it. Maybe when I turn 40, I will I will do that. Anybody else?
Is there any significance to Carolyn Keene? Like, was it an honor of someone? Do you know any history on the actual?
We're not completely sure. Carolyn was kind of a popular name back at the time. There was some other writers that had the name Carolyn, and there was a Carolyn Wells at the time that did some kids' books and more adult mysteries. And she was very popular and prolific. And I don't know if maybe that name, because of some of that, resonated. And we don't have anything specific on why they chose Keene. But sometimes Stratemeyer liked to use words that played on things, like Nancy Drew was a very keen sleuth. So maybe that's kind of why he chose Keene. But that's the best I can kind of come up with on how that was picked. Anybody else? Mike?
I have a couple comments. Great talk. Thank you very much.
Welcome.
The perception with some of us was that the ghostwriters were like sworn to secrecy, that they could not reveal they were Nancy Drew. But when you look at the release that they signed, it doesn't say anything about that you couldn't speak.
Right. So back in those early days, and certainly going back to the first years he formed the syndicate, they were very, very simple like that. There are some examples where Stratemeyer chastised a writer who talked publicly, and he became aware of it, about how these were written on his outlines, and but it wasn't in the release. So I think in some ways maybe Stratemeyer just assumed loyalty on that matter, and people wouldn't say anything. By the time of the 1930s movies, they moved to a little bit more lengthy of a release because they had to find a way to get movie rights in there for Nancy Drew especially. But still, it's nothing like what Simon & Schuster has today, which is, we'll hear maybe more about that tomorrow from our Carolyn Keene. But yeah, it didn't have the secrecy. Like I said, I think Stratemeyer expected people to kind of just not talk about it, He didn't anticipate what would be to come. And Walter Carrig, who wrote those 3 Nancy Drew books, was really kind of a rascal to the syndicate, where he would end up talking about it, and his publicity agent heard about it. So by 1950, he had a book being published, and it got blanketed in areas of the country that he was Carolyn Keene, this dour, naval captain. And so the syndicate, especially Harriet, just got really upset about that. And so Millie wrote to the syndicate when she saw this publicity for Carrig saying he was Carolyn Keene, because at the time she didn't know who he was. She didn't know who had written 8 through 10 when she took a break. And so I'm sure she was kind of shocked to see that it was Walter Carrig that wrote these books. But she kind of wrote to the syndicate saying, if he's talking about it, can I? Kind of inquiring about that. And Harriet wrote her back and said, oh, the syndicate has rued the day that we ever had Walter Carrig. She was very frustrated with him because he also outed himself to the Library of Congress earlier than that and created issues with cataloging where they're contacting the syndicate, this man saying he wrote these books, and they had some difficulties with him. But yeah, the secrecy clause wasn't in there. So it's really neat for you guys to see kind of what was there and just how simple it was. Basically, they just weren't going to take the pen name and write their own books under it, and they were going to use the characters in any of their own stories. And that was, maybe he assumed because they couldn't use the pen name, that meant that they wouldn't talk about being the pen name, but he didn't spell it out. Had he spelled it out, things might be a little more different today. It might be interesting how that would have played out.
And then the second question is, I know that the Stratemeyer ladies were probably not the best business people, but come the 70s when the show was on, and I think the popularity even resurged a little bit more. Any idea like how much they were getting paid from Grosset and Dunlap per book sold?
So it kind of stayed, I think, at around 6%. It was a very low royalty rate. And it didn't change from the beginning until all those decades later. And I think that was a source of why Harriet was so frustrated, because they should be making more than that at that point. And so she tried to renegotiate, and there were issues. And, Grosset was kind of stubborn on that because they were getting a sweetheart of a deal. And that's a big reason why she switched to Simon & Schuster, because she got a better deal with them. Yeah. Any more?
Can you talk a little bit about the artwork in your room and the Jennifer Fisher room?
That's hanging on the walls.
Is it original or are those prints?
They are originals. So Mike loaned the old attic book, and the Message in the Hollow Oak that's hanging in there as well. Those are in his collection. Those are original. Hollow Oak is by artist Rudy Nappy. He bought it from Nappy. And there's another one hanging right inside the room and right above the main classic case. That's a foreign edition that a collector named Jim McNamara donated to the collection. And then outside the room, there's the painting that collector Jamie Seat just donated to the library, Mystery on the Menu, with all the modeling shots and everything. There's a lot of our collectors who like to buy the original art and are really interested in that aspect of the collecting world. I have a few pieces that did not get donated yet that I have hanging in my home too. But I'm not as prolific as a collector as Mike with the art and Jim. They've really kind of spent some good time and dedication to acquiring those pieces. Mike has some really fabulous artwork. So I really appreciate you loaning the artwork for everybody to see here. So thank you for that. Do we have any more questions? And if you can always grab me for the next several days if we don't get to all the questions, and I'm happy to.
And I'll talk about artwork.
Right, and during the panel tomorrow, we'll be talking a little bit about that too. Yeah. Mm-hmm.
Would you'll ever be able to have a stamp, Nancy Drew stamp? Is that completely?
Oh, a Nancy Drew stamp. For several years now, fans have wanted one, especially with the 100th coming up. Simon & Schuster and the licensing company, Moxie and Company, a few years ago for one of the other anniversaries, submitted through the process to try to get a stamp, and it just didn't go anywhere. So I'll have to ask Simon & Schuster if they're looking into that again, because I think for the 100th, even if we just did an Edward Stratemeyer stamp, or just Nancy Drew herself, or Millie would be all pretty awesome. My guess is it would be Nancy Drew that would be featured on the stamp, but it would be neat to have something like that.
Like all of them together.
Right. They usually put 20 stamps on a sheet. You can have 20 different covers. I don't know if they would be like that, but that would be kind of fun.
Just wondering if the library has the Nancy Drew Christmas tree ornaments.
Oh, the one that came out from Carlton Cards. Yeah, it is in there in one of the cases in the back, on this side, I think.
I have one, so the
Yeah. I know. I wish they did more ornaments. I thought it turned out really cute. That was for the 75th anniversary. Any other questions? Okay, just grab me, throughout the week if you want to chat about anything else or have questions. Right now, what I'm going to do is, real quick, our group has presented some awards over the years to different people in the series book community and people related to those behind the scenes of Nancy Drew. And so we gave Millie an honorary sleuth award. That's our highest award back in the day before she passed away. And we've given out a lot of those. We've given out something we call the Sleuth Award. And the award is for great achievement in fostering the enduring legacy of Mildred Ward Benson and Nancy Drew among fans and collectors of many generations. And so we've given this award out to several people in the past as well who have been involved in Nancy Drew in some capacity and have helped with that legacy behind the series and the people that created it. And so I want to present a Sleuth Award to someone very important today who was involved very early on in our organization pretty heavily, who helped get us here to Toledo, who talked up Millie and focused on the history of what she had done, who had a relationship with her, who did displays here at the library of her books, and who was very involved in that aspect of recognition and getting us here and getting me here and starting that sort of ball rolling for this group all this 25 years. He was very kind and very helpful and very generous to all of us back in those early days and still continues to be. So I would like to present this award to one of our founding members, Rick Sayers, sitting over here. It's very much deserved, and I appreciate all of the things that you did. Now the Rare Book Room here has all of Millie's published books thanks to Rick. He just did so much for all the collectors in our group, and we just really appreciate that. So I'd like to present this to you. So I'm gonna bring it over to you. You're welcome. There you go. There you go. So congratulations on that. And yeah, I'm glad you like it. Yeah. That's pretty, it turned out pretty neat, I think. So I'm gonna hand that to you. There you go. Thank you so much for everything. Yeah.
The one you gave me for anybody has.
Oh, okay. Awesome. Oh, yeah. You wanna come over here and I'll get back over here? Okay. Here we go.
I can.
Yeah, if you can get through it on this, yeah.
Oh, yeah, here we go. I'll hold on to that. Okay.
That's cool. Thank you.
You're welcome. You deserve it. So I wanted to do that for you. Thank you so much.
That is cool.
Yeah. You can hang it with all your series books in the living room.
Yeah.
Yep. All right, any final questions before we break for lunch? Okay, so we'll break for lunch. We'll come back here. They're gonna show one of the Nancy Drew movies at 1 here, and that'll be a lot of fun. Just kind of see one of those campy Benita Granville movies together here in the theater. I've never done that before with the group, so we thought that would be a lot of fun. So we'll see you back here at 1. Thank you.